The corporal's knuckles were white, twisted in a fistful of dark hair. He dragged her down the center of the street, her feet stumbling in the thick dust, her cry a choked gasp in the suffocating heat. Windows became empty eyes. Doorways held shadows instead of people. The entire town of Redemption, Texas, held its breath, a silent witness to the brutal spectacle. The woman didn't scream for help. Her defiance was a silent fire in her eyes, a refusal to break before the men who were breaking her. It was a moment that would test the very meaning of honor. They say a single gunshot can echo forever, that this one would save a life, but condemn a soul. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that sometimes a man must break his own rules to do what's right, hit that subscribe button, because you're about to witness the story of Ben and Sarah. They say a single gunshot can echo forever, that this one would save a life, but condemn a soul. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below, and if you believe in second chances, hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss the story of Ben and Sarah. The heat in Redemption, Texas, was a physical weight in the summer of 1866. It pressed down on the dusty street, shimmered above the warped timber of the saloon, and baked the very silence that had fallen over the town. It was a silence of fear, thick and suffocating. Ben Cartwright felt it in his bones, a familiar ache he'd carried back from the war, a ghost that rode with him still. He sat on a bench outside the mercantile, pretending to clean his nails with a pocket knife, his hat pulled low. All he wanted was to be invisible. He'd come to Redemption to disappear, to let the man he'd once been die a quiet death, buried under the endless Texas sky. He had made a vow, sealed in blood and gunpowder on a field in Virginia, that he would never again take up a gun for the sake of a man's war. He was a rancher now, not a soldier. His hands, calloused from leather reins and splintered fence posts, were meant for building, not breaking. Then the silence broke. It was shattered by the scuff of boots, a woman's cry, and the guttural laughter of men who had forgotten what mercy sounded like. Ben looked up, his gut twisting into a cold knot. 3 men. Their blue coats faded and stained, but the arrogance of the victor still bright in their eyes, were dragging a woman from the town's small church. They weren't just escorting her. They were hauling her like a sack of grain. One of them, a corporal with a face like a clenched fist, had a fistful of her long, dark hair. Her head was yanked back at a brutal angle, her feet stumbling in the thick dust, one of her shoes lost. She wasn't screaming. Her defiance was in her silence, in the furious, helpless glare she fixed on the horizon, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her pleas. Ben's world narrowed to that single, horrific image. Her hair, dark as a raven's wing, twisted in the corporal's hand. The people of Redemption watched from behind parted curtains and from the shadowed alleyways. They were ghosts in their own town, paralyzed by the post-war order where a Union coat was a license to do as you pleased. This was not their fight. Ben tried to make it not his fight, either. He closed his eyes, the scent of dust and sweat filling his nostrils, the ghosts of Shiloh and Antietam whispering in his ears. Not your war, not your cause. You made a promise. But the woman's gasp as she stumbled and hit her knee on a stone cut through the phantom noise. It was a sound of pure pain, sharp and real. Ben's eyes snapped open. He saw the grime on her cheek, the tear in the sleeve of her simple calico dress, the raw terror that now flickered in her eyes as she looked at the smirking faces above her. And he knew his vow, made in the shadow of death, was about to be broken in the light of day. Honor was a word men liked to use to justify killing. He'd learned that the hard way. But what was the word for a man who watches a woman be brutalized and does nothing? Slowly, deliberately. He stood up. The movement drew the corporal's attention. "Something on your mind, Johnny Reb?" the man sneered, giving the woman's hair another vicious tug. Ben's face was a stone mask. He didn't answer. His past was a dead language, and he refused to speak it. Instead, his hand moved with a speed that felt alien to him now. A memory awakened in his muscles. He didn't draw the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. That was for killing. He reached for the rifle sheathed on his saddle, leaning against the mercantile wall. The worn stock felt both strange and familiar in his hand. He didn't aim at the corporal. He didn't aim at any of them. He aimed at the sky. The shot was deafening in the charged silence. It wasn't a bullet of aggression, but a full stop. A period at the end of their cruelty. The birds that had been chattering in the eaves of the livery scattered into the searing blue sky. The corporal and his men froze, their hands instinctively flying to their own weapons, their eyes wide with shock, searching for the source of the shot. In that heartbeat of stunned inaction, Ben moved. He dropped the rifle, his body already in motion. His other hand went to the lariat coiled on his saddle horn. It was a tool of his new life, the rope he used to wrangle cattle. With a flick of his wrist that was all instinct, the loop sailed through the air. It wasn't aimed at a man, but it flew just over the corporal's shoulder, a whisper of hemp and threat. It settled perfectly around the woman's shoulders, under her arms. Before the men could process what was happening, Ben was already pulling back on the rope, his horse stepping back with him. The woman, Sarah, was pulled free from the corporal's grasp. He was left holding only a few strands of dark hair. She stumbled towards Ben, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Ben didn't hesitate. He swept her off her feet, one arm hooking under her knees, the other securely around her back, and swung her onto his saddle. In one fluid motion, he was up behind her, grabbing the reins. "What in God's name?" the corporal bellowed, finally shaking off his stupor and drawing his pistol. But it was too late. Ben dug his heels into his horse's flanks. The powerful buckskin lunged forward, not back through the town, but down a narrow alleyway between the blacksmith and the feed store. A pistol shot cracked behind them, the bullet splintering the corner of the building, but they were already gone. They burst out into the open chaparral behind the town, the horse's hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. Ben held Sarah tight against his chest, the smell of her hair and her fear filling his senses. He could feel the tremors running through her body. He had fired a bullet. He had thrown a rope. And now, with a woman he didn't know in his arms and the ghosts of his past screaming in his wake, he rode. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he was running from a town called Redemption, a place that had just forced him to condemn himself. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the vast, empty canvas of the Texas plains in hues of orange, purple, and blood. They had ridden for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the furious shouts that had faded behind them. Ben had pushed his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, to the edge of its endurance before finally finding a secluded wash, a deep scar in the earth screened by mesquite and palo verde trees. Here, the world was silent, save for the ragged sound of their own breathing and the chirr of evening insects. Ben slid from the saddle first, his legs stiff. He turned and held up his arms for Sarah. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her hands braced on the saddle horn before allowing him to help her down. Her feet touched the ground, and she swayed, her body finally succumbing to the day's trauma. Ben's hands steadied her shoulders. For a moment, they stood there, two strangers bound by an act of sudden, desperate violence. He could feel the fine tremble in her frame, and he let go, stepping back to give her space. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little more than a whisper, raw and cracked. She wouldn't meet his eyes, instead staring at the rope that still lay coiled on his saddle, the instrument of her rescue. Ben just gave a curt nod, his throat too tight for words. He busied himself with the horse, unsaddling Dust and rubbing him down with a handful of dry grass. The familiar routine was grounding, a bulwark against the chaos that had just re-entered his life. He had broken his vow. The weight of that failure was a physical thing, a cold stone in his gut. He could still feel the phantom kick of the rifle against his shoulder, smell the acrid tang of gunpowder. As twilight deepened into a star-dusted night, he built a small, smokeless fire in the shelter of an undercut bank, using dry wood that wouldn't betray their position. The flames cast flickering shadows against the dirt walls of the wash, creating an illusion of a room in the heart of the wilderness. He offered her the last of his jerky and the water from his canteen. She took them without a word, her movement slow and deliberate. They sat in silence for a long time, the crackle of the fire the only conversation between them. Ben watched her from the corner of his eye. She had pulled her torn dress together as best she could and had tried to smooth her tangled hair. In the firelight, he could see the bruising on her cheek and the raw, red mark on her scalp where the corporal had gripped her. But he also saw the strength in the set of her jaw, the intelligence in her clear, gray eyes that were now fixed on the flames. She was not a broken thing. "They'll come after you," she said finally, her gaze still on the fire. "You interfered with union business." "What business was that?" Ben asked, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah took a shaky breath. "My husband. He was Captain John Allister, Confederate cavalry." She said the words flatly, a statement of fact, not of pride. "He died at Appomattox, but before the end, he and his men, they liberated a Union payroll wagon. Not payroll, rifles, a whole arsenal of new Spencer repeaters, ammunition, dynamite. It was meant to arm a resistance that never happened." Ben felt that cold stone in his gut grow heavier. This was infinitely worse than a simple, brutal act of revenge against a dead soldier's wife. This was about weapons. This was about the war that was supposed to be over. "They think he told me where it was hidden," she continued, her voice gaining a thread of desperate energy. "That man, Corporal Jennings, he served at the prison camp where my husband's men were held. He's convinced John left me a map, a letter, something. He's been hounding me for months. It started with questions, then threats. Today he was done asking." "Did he?" Ben asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "Did your husband tell you?" Sarah finally looked at him, and her gray eyes were deep and haunted. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "He did. He made me memorize it. A place in the canyons. He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to use it to get away, to barter for safe passage west. He thought it was my salvation. Instead, it's become a curse." The pieces clicked into place with grim finality. Ben understood now. He hadn't just saved a woman from a mob of thugs. He had stepped into the middle of a powder keg. He had inherited her war. The pursuit wouldn't be a half-hearted affair by a few angry soldiers. It would be a relentless, organized hunt led by a man who had a fortune in stolen weaponry dangling just out of his reach. He looked at Sarah, truly looked at her. He saw the terror she was trying so hard to conceal, but beneath it, an iron resolve. She was a woman with a deadly secret, a secret that had now become his burden as well. The wolves were not just on the wind, they were on their trail, and he, a man who had sworn off violence, was now her sole protector. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn wool blanket, handing it to her. "Get some sleep," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I'll take the first watch." She took the blanket, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact was like a spark in the cool night air. "Ben," she said, using his name for the first time. He'd told it to her as they'd ridden. A single word to answer her whispered question. "Why did you do it?" Ben stared into the fire, at the embers that glowed like the eyes of a predator in the dark. He thought of his vow, of the peace he had so desperately craved. He thought of the sight of her being dragged by the hair, an image of casual cruelty that had ripped through his defenses. "My father once told me," he said slowly, his voice raspy with memories, "that some things are wrong enough to make a good man break his own rules." He looked out into the darkness that surrounded their small island of light. "I guess I'm just hoping I'm still a good man." For 2 days, they moved through a landscape that was both beautiful and brutal. They traveled by night, guided by the cold light of the stars, and hid during the searing heat of the day in rock crevices and thickets of thorny acacia. Ben's skills, honed by years on the trail and sharpened by the war, he tried to forget, kept them alive. He taught Sarah how to read the signs of the land, how to find water, how to move without leaving a trace. She was a quick study, her quiet determination a constant source of surprise. The memory of the rope he had used to save her was a silent presence. He kept it perfectly coiled on his saddle, a constant reminder of the choice he'd made. On the third night, the sky turned against them. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an oppressive humidity that clung to their skin. The stars disappeared behind a fast-moving veil of bruised purple clouds. Ben tasted the air and knew what was coming. "We need to find high ground," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." He urged Dust into a narrow, rock-strewn canyon, hoping to find a ledge or cave that would offer shelter from the coming deluge. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, claustrophobic and dark. They were a dozen miles in when the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splatting into the dust like dark coins. Within minutes, the drops became a torrent, a solid sheet of water that soaked them to the bone and turned the dry arroyo beneath them into a muddy stream. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting open, and lightning bleached the canyon in stark, terrifying flashes of white. The stream was quickly becoming a river. A low roar began to build from deeper in the canyon, a sound of unimaginable power. "Flash flood!" Ben yelled over the storm. "Up! We have to climb!" He spotted a fissure in the canyon wall, a steep, narrow chimney leading up to a small, protected ledge about 20 feet above the canyon floor. There was no time to be gentle. He half pushed, half lifted Sarah towards the handholds. "Climb, don't look down!" She scrambled up the slick rock, her fingers finding purchase, her dress tearing further on the sharp edges. Ben was right behind her, boosting her from below, his own boots slipping in the mud. They tumbled onto the ledge just as a wall of churning brown water, thick with uprooted trees and debris, thundered past where they had stood seconds before. The roar was deafening, the sheer force of the water a terrifying spectacle. They were trapped, marooned on a small island of rock in the middle of a raging, temporary river. Shivering and soaked, they huddled at the back of the ledge, which offered a slight overhang for shelter. The storm raged around them, a symphony of chaos. In one of the brilliant, strobing flashes of lightning, Sarah saw it, a network of pale, jagged scars across Ben's back, visible through his soaked and plastered shirt. Before she could stop herself, her hand reached out, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the marks. Ben flinched as if he'd been burned, a sharp, involuntary hiss of breath. He pulled away, turning to face her, his eyes dark and tormented in the fleeting light. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one she saw in his face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling her hand back. "I didn't mean." "It's nothing," he said, his voice tight. But it was a lie. They both knew it. The flash flood had trapped their bodies, but the enforced intimacy was now prying open their secrets. They sat in a tense silence, the roar of the water below them a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice soft but insistent. "You saved my life. Ben, you've shared your food, your water. You're risking everything for me. But you won't share this?" She gestured vaguely towards his back. "I've told you my burden. Don't I deserve to know a piece of yours?" Another crash of thunder shook the canyon. Ben stared out at the churning water. His jaw clenched so tight, the muscles stood out in his cheek. The ghosts he ran from were no longer whispering. They were screaming in the wind and the rain. "It was at a place called Cold Harbor," he said, his voice hollow, seeming to come from a great distance. "It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. We were ordered to charge a fortified position. We knew it was suicide, but we went. The man next to me, he was just a boy, no older than 17. Name was Luke. Used to talk about his mother's apple pies." Ben's gaze was unfocused, seeing a different time, a different hell. "We got pinned down in a ditch. The artillery. It was relentless. It didn't just kill you. It took you apart. Luke was hit. Badly. He was screaming for his mother, for me to help him. But if I moved, we'd both be dead." He paused, swallowing hard. Another shell landed. Close. So close the blast threw me against a broken cannon caisson. That's where the scars came from. When I came to, Luke was quiet. There wasn't enough left of him to bury. He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw the full, devastating weight of his vow. I lay there for hours, pretending to be dead, and I swore an oath to God, to that boy, to myself, that if I survived, if I ever got out of that hell, I would never again raise a weapon in a man's conflict. I would never again be the reason for a single gunshot, for a single drop of spilled blood. His voice broke on the last word. "And in your town, I broke that oath for you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and profound. Sarah's heart ached for him, for the boy he had been and the haunted man he had become. The storm hadn't just revealed his scars, it had revealed his soul. She moved closer, not with pity, but with a deep, resonant understanding. She reached out and took his hand, the one he held clenched in a fist. Her touch was gentle but firm. "That boy. Luke," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the tempest. "He was screaming for help, and you couldn't give it. But in redemption, I was the one in the dust. I couldn't scream, and you heard me anyway." His calloused fingers slowly uncurled, his hand gripping hers like a drowning man grasping a lifeline. The raging water below them was a force of destruction, but here, on this tiny ledge, something new was being forged in the heart of the storm, a bond of shared wounds, a fragile trust that was more powerful than any vow. The floodwaters receded as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a canyon floor coated in a thick layer of stinking mud and debris. Their prison had become a path again, but they had lost precious time, and most of their meager supplies had been swept away. The jerky was gone, and their bedrolls were soaked and useless. Only the canteen, Ben's rifle, and the rope remained. Hunger was now a constant, gnawing companion. "There's an outpost," Ben said, his voice raspy from thirst as they trudged through the muck. "Chaparral Station. It's run by a man I used to know, Jebediah. He's a traitor, not a soldier, a neutral man, if such a thing exists anymore. We can get supplies there. He'll be discreet." Hope, for the first time in days, was a tangible thing. The thought of fresh water, of real food, of a moment's safety, spurred them onward. They traveled for another day, the landscape shifting from rocky canyons to the dry, scrubby plains that gave the station its name. Chaparral Station wasn't a town, just a collection of adobe buildings huddled around a well, a solitary bastion of commerce in the vast emptiness. As they approached, a portly, balding man with a nervous energy came out to greet them. "Ben Cartwright. By God, I thought you were a ghost." The man, Jebediah, pumped Ben's hand, his eyes darting from Ben to Sarah and back again. "Jeb," Ben said, with a weary but genuine smile. "It's good to see you. My companion and I are in need of supplies. We ran into some trouble with a flash flood." "A flood, you say?" "Terrible things," Jebediah said, wiping his sweaty palms on his apron. He ushered them inside the cool, dark trading post. The air was thick with the scent of leather, coffee, and dried herbs. To Ben and Sarah, it smelled like paradise. Of course. Anything for an old friend. Water first, I'd wager." He bustled around, providing them with fresh water from the well that tasted sweeter than any wine, and laying out cheese, dried apples, and hardtack. As they ate, ravenously, Ben felt a measure of his tension ease. The station felt safe. Jebediah was full of nervous chatter, asking about Ben's ranching life, carefully avoiding any mention of the war. Sarah remained quiet, watchful, her initial relief tempered by a caution that had become second nature. She noticed the way Jebediah's eyes kept flicking towards the door, the way he kept wiping his hands. "We'll need 2 horses, if you can spare them," Ben said, pushing a few worn coins across the counter, "and enough supplies for a week's travel west." "Horses, yes, of course. Fine animals out back," Jebediah stammered, his eyes darting to the door again. Just let me get your things packed up." He disappeared into a back room. Ben looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She gave a slight shake of her head, her hand resting near the small knife Ben had given her. Something was wrong. The air was thick with more than the scent of coffee. It was thick with betrayal. Ben's survival instincts, the ones he'd been suppressing, flared to life. He remembered a trick he'd used during the war, a lesson learned in the harshest of schools. He casually walked to the front window, as if to look out at the setting sun, but his eyes were on the reflection in the dusty glass. He could see the road leading to the station, and on it, a small plume of dust was rising, a plume made by at least 3 riders, moving fast. "Jeb!" Ben called out, his voice sharp and cold, losing all its earlier warmth. "Are you expecting company?" Jebediah emerged from the back room, his face pale and slick with sweat. He couldn't meet Ben's gaze. "Now, Ben, you have to understand. A man has to make a living. The corporal, he sent a rider ahead to all the outposts. A big reward for information." The bitter taste of betrayal filled Ben's mouth. This man, this old friend, had sold them out for a handful of dollars. There was no time for anger. There was only action. "Sarah, the back door, now!" Ben commanded. He kicked the heavy wooden counter, sending it crashing to the floor and blocking the front entrance just as the first shouts came from outside. "Jennings, they're in there!" Ben didn't wait. He grabbed a sack of supplies Jebediah had packed and vaulted over the debris, pushing Sarah through the back door. They burst out into the corral behind the station. The horses Jeb had spoken of were there, tethered and nervous, as Ben worked frantically on the knots of 2 stout-looking Mustangs. A gunshot splintered the wooden gatepost next to his head. Corporal Jennings and his 2 men were rounding the building, rifles raised. "Nowhere to run! Reb!" Jennings yelled, his face a mask of triumph. Ben got the reins free. "Get on!" he yelled to Sarah. He slapped the rump of her horse, sending it bolting out of the open end of the corral. He swung himself onto his own mount just as another bullet whizzed past his ear. He leaned low over the horse's neck, digging his heels in, urging it into a desperate gallop. The chase was frantic, a mad dash across the chaparral. But Jennings and his men had fresher horses. They were gaining. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at them from the scrub brush. Ben knew they couldn't outrun them for long. He needed to even the odds. He risked a glance back. Jennings was closing, raising his rifle for a clear shot. Ben reacted on pure instinct. He yanked his own rifle from its sheath, the one he had vowed not to use. He reined his horse in sharply, causing it to pivot on its haunches. He didn't aim for Jennings. He aimed for the horse. The shot was steady, the culmination of years of training he could not erase. The report of the rifle echoed across the plains. Jennings' horse screamed and went down in a cloud of dust, sending the corporal flying. The other two men reined in sharply, thrown into confusion. It was the opening they needed. Ben turned and spurred his horse on, riding hard towards the darkening labyrinth of canyons in the distance. He had bought them time, but the cost was heavy. He had used his rifle not just for a warning shot, but as a weapon. He had inflicted harm to protect Sarah. Jebediah's betrayal had proven that there were no safe havens, no neutral men. And the rifle in his hand was no longer just a symbol of a broken vow. It was now their only chance of survival. The enemy's reach was longer and more venomous than they had ever imagined, and it had forced Ben to become the one thing he swore he would never be again. The canyons where John Allister had hidden the Union arsenal were known to the few locals who dared venture near them as the Devil's Anvil. It was a maze of sun-blasted red rock, twisted and folded by eons of heat and pressure into shapes that looked like the bones of ancient giants. After shaking Jennings, Ben and Sarah had ridden deep into this hostile territory, following the memorized directions Sarah recited like a prayer. The memory of Jebediah's betrayal was a fresh wound, a stark reminder that they were utterly alone. "It's here," Sarah said. Her voice hushed. They stood at the entrance to a narrow slot canyon, barely wider than a horse. He said to follow the snake-shaped rock until the canyon walls weep. They dismounted and led the horses into the oppressive shadow of the canyon. After 100 yards, they saw it, a dark stain on the sandstone wall, where a trickle of water seeped from the rock, a miracle of life in this dead place. Following Allister's final instruction, Ben felt along the rock face behind a curtain of dry vines. His fingers found a loose stone. He pried it out, and then another, and another, until a dark, man-made opening was revealed. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled of dust, metal, and something else, the faint, cloying scent of dormant violence. Ben lit a match, the small flame pushing back the absolute darkness. The light fell upon a stack of long wooden crates. He used his knife to pry one open. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, lay a row of Spencer repeating rifles, their metal and wood gleaming dully. Another crate revealed boxes of cartridges. And in the back, stacked like cordwood, were several crates stenciled with a stark warning: dynamite. This was it. The Devil's Cache, the source of Sarah's curse, the object of Jennings' obsession, and now, the ultimate test of Ben's soul. He stood before the weapons, the physical manifestation of the war he had survived. Each rifle was a potential death. Each stick of dynamite held the power to tear the world apart. The sheer weight of it all seemed to suck the air from the small cave. This was what he had run from. This was the monster he had tried to starve within himself. And now, he stood in its lair. He backed away from the crates, a profound weariness settling over him. He felt the pull of his vow, the memory of Luke's screams, the promise he had made to himself in the mud and blood. To use these weapons would be the final, irrevocable betrayal of that promise. To destroy them would be to leave himself and Sarah defenseless against Jennings, who would surely find them eventually. He felt crushed, caught between an impossible past and an indefensible future. He slid down the cave wall and sat on the dusty floor, burying his face in his hands. The silence was absolute. He was a man hollowed out by his own convictions. Sarah watched him, her heart aching. She saw not the hardened soldier or the capable survivor, but a man breaking under the weight of his own honor. She had been the victim, the one needing rescue. But in the firelight of their first camp, in the terror of the flash flood, and in the frantic escape from Chaparral Station, she had come to see the man himself, a man of deep, painful integrity. She would not let him face this alone. She walked over and knelt in front of him. She didn't touch him. She simply waited until he slowly raised his head, his eyes full of a pain that was deeper than any physical wound. "When Corporal Jennings was dragging me through that street," she said, her voice soft but steady, "he told me what he would do when he found this place. He wasn't going to turn it over to the army. He and his men were going to sell it. To anyone. Raiders, bandits, maybe even to men who want to start the war all over again. This isn't about Union justice, Ben. It's about greed." She paused, letting the words settle in the cold air. "Your vow," she continued, "you made it to honor the dead, to reject the senseless slaughter of a war fought by politicians. But this is different. This isn't a battle line drawn in the dirt between two armies. That is a snake in our path. Protecting me, protecting yourself, ensuring these guns don't fall into the hands of men like Jennings. Is that a violation of your honor? Or is it the ultimate expression of it?" She offered him a choice, a redefinition of his rigid code. "We can destroy it all, right now," she said, her gaze unwavering. "We can use the dynamite to seal this cave forever, and we can take our chances in the wild. I will stand by that choice. Or, you can use these tools to defend what is right now, in this canyon, and I will stand by that choice, too." She wasn't telling him what to do. She was telling him that whatever he decided, he was no longer alone in it. She was giving him back the one thing he thought he'd lost forever, a choice that wasn't dictated by the ghosts of his past. Ben looked from her clear, steady eyes to the dark, silent rifles. He thought of the rope he'd used to save her, a rancher's tool used for rescue. He thought of the rifle shot at the sky, a soldier's tool used for a warning. He thought of the shot at Jennings' horse, a necessary act of harm to prevent a greater one. The world was not black and white, as he had tried to make it. It was 1,000 shades of gray, and survival, true survival, meant learning to navigate them. Slowly, painfully. He reached out and laid his hand on the cold wood of a rifle crate. It was not the gesture of a soldier eagerly taking up arms, but of a man accepting a terrible, necessary burden. He had made a vow to never take a life. Now, he was making a new choice, to protect one. The Devil's Anvil became their fortress. Ben knew that Jennings, deprived of his horse but not his obsession, would be on their trail as soon as he could get a new mount. Running was no longer an option. They were too deep in the labyrinth, and their tracks would be easy enough for a determined man to follow. Their only chance was to make their stand, here, in the place that held the prize. The decision to fight had settled in Ben's soul, not with a hot fire of vengeance, but with a cold, grim resolve. For 2 days, they prepared. The work was a silent communion, a partnership forged in desperation. Sarah, using her knowledge of the canyon's layout, became his strategist, pointing out choke points and ambush sites. Ben, his soldier's mind fully awakened, became his old self again, the man he had tried to bury. He worked with a chilling efficiency that both frightened and reassured Sarah. He chose a defensible position, a high, narrow pass that was the only viable entrance to the hidden cave. He showed Sarah how to load and fire one of the Spencer rifles, the weight of it awkward in her hands, but her jaw set with determination. He placed sticks of dynamite in crevices along the canyon walls, not as traps to kill, but as tools to shape the battlefield, running long fuses back to their position. He used the rope from his saddle, the one that had started this entire ordeal, to rig a deadfall of loose rock above the pass. He was not creating a killing field in the style of Cold Harbor. He was building a wall, a desperate defense to keep the world at bay. On the third morning, as the sun began to bake the red rocks, they appeared. Jennings, his face livid with sunburn and fury, was leading 2 other men. They moved cautiously up the canyon, rifles at the ready. "Alistair!" Jennings' voice echoed off the canyon walls, misidentifying Ben. "I know you're in here. You and the witch. Give me the rifles, and I might let you walk out of here. Maybe?" Ben and Sarah lay flat behind a barricade of rocks they had built. Ben didn't answer. Silence was his ally. He waited, his breathing slow and even, the Spencer rifle cool and heavy in his hands. He watched as Jennings and his men advanced into the narrow pass, directly below the rigged deadfall. "Now," Ben whispered to Sarah. Sarah, her hands trembling, but her eyes fixed, touched the lit end of a cigarillo to the fuse of the deadfall. The fuse sputtered to life, a fizzing snake of fire. Seconds later, a sharp crack echoed through the canyon as the small charge broke the key rocks. With a deafening roar, tons of rock and scree cascaded down, completely blocking the pass. It didn't hit the men, but it trapped them. Jennings and his men whirled around, firing wildly at the top of the ridge, their bullets chipping away at the rocks around Ben and Sarah. "You're trapped in here with us now, you fool!" Gus Jennings screamed, his voice raw with rage. "No!" Ben said to himself. "You're trapped in here with me." The battle was a grim, calculated affair. It was a siege of dust and echoes. Ben didn't engage in a firefight. He used the canyon itself as his weapon. When the men tried to climb the walls to flank them, he had Sarah light another fuse. The resulting explosion didn't harm them, but it created a small avalanche of shale, making the wall impassable. He used the superior range and repeating action of the Spencer rifle to keep them pinned down. His shots not aimed at their bodies, but at the rocks around them, peppering them with stinging, terrifying fragments. The hours wore on. The sun reached its zenith, turning the canyon into an oven. Water became the most critical weapon of all. Ben and Sarah had the weeping wall. Jennings and his men had only what was in their canteens. By late afternoon, their return fire grew sporadic, their shouts weaker. Desperation was setting in. Then, Jennings tried a final, desperate gambit. Under the cover of a volley of fire from his men, he made a break for a narrow, shadowed fissure Ben hadn't been able to block. If he got through, he could circle around behind them. Ben saw him. There was no time to set a trap, no time for a warning shot. There was only Jennings, a rifle in his hands, scrambling over the rocks, a direct threat to Sarah. The world narrowed to his rifle sights. He thought of Luke. He thought of his vow. And he thought of Sarah's face, pale but resolute, beside him. He aimed. He fired. The shot was clean. Jennings cried out, not in death, but in pain, and crumpled to the ground, his leg shattering beneath him. He dropped his rifle, his face a mask of agony and shock. His 2 men, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They threw down their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. It was over. The silence that fell was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. Ben stood up slowly, the rifle feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. He looked down at the scene below. One man wounded, two surrendering. He had won. He had protected Sarah. But as he looked at her, he saw that the victory was not without its cost. A stray bullet, a ricochet from the final volley, had grazed her arm. Blood was soaking the sleeve of her dress, a stark, crimson stain against the drab cloth. The sight of her blood, shed in this conflict he had brought her into, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had broken his vow to save her life, but he had failed to keep her from harm. He had paid the price for their survival, and that price was marked in her blood. The dawn that followed the siege was quiet and cool. The air, scrubbed clean by the night, carried the scent of dust and distant rain. Ben had tied up Jennings' men and tended to the corporal's shattered leg as best he could, his movements efficient and devoid of malice. He was a soldier again, dealing with the aftermath. He left them with water and the promise that he would send the law from the next real town they found, a town that wasn't for sale. Now, in the first light. He sat with Sarah near the weeping wall, the source of their salvation. He had cleaned and bandaged the wound on her arm. It was a clean flesh wound, but it was a stark, physical symbol of their ordeal. The sight of the white bandage against her skin was a constant reproach. They hadn't spoken much. The chaos of the battle had given way to a heavy, thoughtful silence. The stolen arsenal was sealed behind tons of rock, the canyon their tomb. Jennings' greed was buried with it. The external threat was gone, but the landscape of their own souls had been irrevocably altered. Ben stared at his hands. These were the same hands that had refused to hold a gun, that had sought peace in the feel of leather and wood. Now they knew the familiar weight of a rifle stock once more. The slight tremor after a shot was fired. He had not killed, but he had not been a man of peace either. He was something in between, something new and unsettling. Sarah watched him, sensing the turmoil behind his quiet facade. She reached out with her uninjured arm and gently covered his hands with her own. Her touch was not one of pity, but of acceptance. "You're thinking about your vow," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. "I broke it. The moment I pulled that trigger, the man I was trying to be, he died." "No," she said, her voice firm, compelling him to look at her. "That man didn't die. He just finally realized that a vow made to the dead can't be more important than the life of the living. You didn't fight for a flag or a cause. You fought for me. There is honor in that. Ben, more honor than in any promise made on a battlefield." He looked at her then. Truly, saw her. Her face was smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but her gray eyes were clear and full of a strength he'd never seen before. She was not the terrified woman he had pulled from the dust. She was his partner, his strategist, the moral compass that had guided him through his own internal darkness. He had saved her life, but she, in turn, had saved his soul from the prison of his past. Slowly, he turned his hands over and laced his fingers with hers. It was an admission, an acceptance, a new kind of vow. They packed what little they had onto the 2 Mustangs they'd taken from Chaparral Station. They didn't look back at the sealed pass or the canyon that had been their crucible. They rode out of the Devil's Anvil and into the open plains, the rising sun warming their faces. The horizon was a clean, endless line of possibility. They were no longer running from a pursuing evil, but riding towards an unknown future. They were 2 wounded, weary people, a man who had learned that peace must sometimes be defended, and a woman who had found her strength in the heart of chaos. They rode side by side, their hands clasped for a moment before taking up the reins, bound not by a shared trauma, but by a new promise, silent and profound, to build a life together on the other side of the fire. In the vast, silent theater of the West, the story of a single life can feel as insignificant as a lone hawk circling an empty sky. But sometimes, an act of defiance, a choice made in a heartbeat, can ripple outward, changing not only the course of two lives, but the very definition of the words they live by. Honor, Ben Cartwright learned, was not a rigid monument to a painful past, but a living, breathing thing, a seed that could only grow in the soil of compassion. It was not the avoidance of violence that defined him, but the reason he was forced to embrace it. He sought redemption from a war that had stained the soul of a nation, but found it not in solitude, but in the fierce, unwilling connection to another human being. For Sarah, the West was not a place of escape, but of discovery. She found that her own resilience was a force more potent than any hidden arsenal, and that true safety was not a location on a map, but a shared trust with another. Their journey was not just across the rugged Texas plains, but through the treacherous canyons of the human heart. They faced down the ghosts of a nation's conflict, the greed of broken men, and the fury of an unforgiving nature. In the end, they walked out of the shadow of death, not as a rescuer and his ward, but as equals, their future a blank page upon which they would write a new story together. It is a story that reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of salvation are not born of strength, but of the willingness to break our own rules for the sake of another's soul.